Hello, BookTube, and welcome back to the Steve Tiberius Donoghue Book Club for February. We are in our third installment, our third book club meeting, your third STD infection of this book, Antonia Fraser's biography of Marie Antoinette, who is a thumbnail figure, usually, in anyone's knowledge of history. Let them eat cake, right? And her famous end. Is usually all that anybody knows about this character. Despite a large number of biographies that have tried to go into a lot of detail, tried to put flesh on the bones of those two anecdotes, and that's what this book tries to do. We started out with our first book club meeting with a young Marie Antoinette, a young Marie, living in the court of the great Empress Maria Theresa, and largely overshadowed by that figure. And then we moved on next time to her going into France and getting to know the court at Versailles, getting to know her initially very standoffish and somewhat odd husband, getting to know all of the power players at court, again being overshadowed by her mother, who wrote her constant notes and also set spies on her so that she would know everything, so that Maria Theresa would know everything. We followed that acclimation. Young Marie has to acclimate herself to France. She insists that people talk to her in French. She insists that people write to her in French. That she doesn't want to be a German stranger. She wants to be a quintessential French reigning monarch when the time comes. And in that last batch of chapters that we read, the time did come. She and her husband are elevated to the monarchy. And that's where we find them at the beginning of the chapters that we're reading today. And these chapters, there are several obstacles that a biographer, not necessarily obstacles, but there are several things that a biographer of a famous figure like this, who is known very lightly. Marie Antoinette is a famous name, but she is not known except for tiny little details. When you come to the task of writing a new biography for a general interest audience on a figure like that, you have several challenges. Let's just call them challenges instead of obstacles. One is that sooner or later you're going to have to get down into the weeds of what this person's daily life was like. And oftentimes, general interest readers who only know one little thumbnail, et tu, Brutus, or that sort of thing, about a historical figure, oftentimes they don't really want to go into the weeds on that sort of thing. It's a formidable obstacle. The more well-known I think the little details are, the more formidable it is. There was just recently, for instance, a huge biography of Maria Theresa that was in the weeds for the whole of its length. And the same is true for lots of other big famous figures where the weeds aren't that well known. In other words, you face the challenge of making that interesting, and that is what we're getting in these chapters this time around. Is how do you make Marie's life in France interesting? You would think it wouldn't be an uphill climb because she's queen consort, so you'd think that would have a certain inherent amount of interest, but no, she is at first a much praised and celebrated addition to French life, just French royal life, and in these chapters, we see Antonia Fraser deal with that obstacle. How do you get into the nitty-gritty details of what she's doing? That's one obstacle. I think it's done really well here, and it's done really well in the same way that Antonia Fraser has done it really well in the rest of the book, which is a perfect balance of fast-paced, informed general narrative that is pinned down to the canvas at regular intervals with great little personal vignettes, great quotes, great little moments, great reconstructed dialogue. That's a skill for a popular biographer. Not all biographers can do that. Yeah, and this one can. So that works. That obstacle is neatly cleared, I think, in these chapters. Another obstacle, not all biographers feel this way. Some of them don't. But when you spend a lot of time in archives with your chosen subject, you can maintain a critical indifference. It's possible. It's rare, but it's possible. But ordinarily, what's going to happen is going to be one of two things. You're either going to feel Stockholm Syndrome, so you're going to start to think that your subject can do no wrong, or you're going to come to hate your subject. and even though they've been dead for centuries, you're going to come out with a hatchet job of their personality. Maybe obstacle is also the wrong word here. Maybe obstacle or challenge are all wrong. Maybe it's just a thing that you have to think about when you read a popular biography. You certainly have to think about it here, because in these chapters, in another biographer's hands, Marie would be more guilty than innocent. And in these chapters with Antonia Fraser, she's more innocent than guilty by a wide margin. Of all the things that have been imputed to her, this is the period where you get, Madame Deficit and wild, exaggerated tall tales about Marie's excessive spending, about her frivolity, about her stupidity, about her callousness towards her own children, her own subjects, her own family members. In other biographical treatments, these would be handled in different ways. Here, it becomes clear, especially in these chapters that we're reading today, that Antonia Fraser wants to exonerate Marie Antoinette of almost everything. So that's another thing. We'll come back to that one. The third obstacle, the third challenge to a biographer is when the end of the subject's life is well known. If you are Julian Jackson and you are writing a 1,000-page biography of Charles de Gaulle, well, if you ask an average person on the street how Charles de Gaulle died, they won't know. They won't have any idea. If you ask an average person on the street how Franklin Delano Roosevelt died, they won't have any idea. The death in those cases does not overshadow the life. When you read a 1,000-page biography of Harry Truman by David McCullough, it is not overshadowed by the death because you don't know how Harry Truman died. Every once in a while, whether it's to Brute or not, every once in a while, the end is one of the few facts you know about the figure, and that is true here. You know that Marie Antoinette did not live to a ripe old age in the warm regard of her people as her mother did. And the closer you get to that, I mean, it's going to be a major factor in our next batch of chapters, but the closer you get to that, the more preponderant it is in the narrative. Especially since the chapters that we're reading today end in the year 1788. And even a casual student of history knows what the year 1789 means. So when Marie Antoinette, when Antonia Fraser quotes her in these chapters here, is writing to her brother and saying, "Oh God, 1788 was such a terrible year. Here's hoping next year is better." You can't help but laugh. Even as tragic as it is, you can't help but laugh. It's usually poor form to laugh at characters in history for their ignorance of the future. You don't have any knowledge of the future either. You don't want future generations laughing at you. Unless you're absolutely sure. Every once in a while, something will be coming in your society. Some, presidential candidate, some social short-sightedness. And plenty of people will be able to look at it and say, no, this is a terrible idea, and only disaster is going to result from this. But for all of the one or two voices in the late 1780s suspecting that something was boiling over, that the country is not happy, one of them is quoted very presciently in 1788 saying, "I think the whole country's on the edge of blowing apart." For all the one or two of those, there were plenty of other people who did not think that, who only hoped for the best. We'll muddle along. Next year will be much like this year, maybe a little bit worse, maybe a little bit better. You as a reader know that's not true. You know that the whole, not just France, but the whole world is heading towards a watershed moment, a watershed year. The warning signs are there. You would think the warning signs would be there. Certainly the Marie Antoinette that Antonia Fraser gives us is a smart woman. She is her mother's daughter. She is smart. She is acute. In these chapters, she's rather touchingly wanting to be more use, wanting not to be decorative and just turn out children. I also would like to sit in on council meetings, maybe learn about this sort of thing, maybe learn about the issues that are facing the people. Maybe I can help. That's fascinating, and that's not in the normal thumbnail sketch of Marie Antoinette that anyone thinks. Is it true? Well, that's one of the bargains that you make if you read biography for pleasure, as I do and as I advocate people do, is that you acknowledge there's artistry involved here. There's storytelling involved. You would hope that there wouldn't be any deceit. But I have said many times that novelists can also lie. You would hope that a biographer is not simply deceiving you, that the biographer has all the records in front of them, and they are not ignoring anything. They are simply pushing some forward and putting some back, calling some into question and trusting others in order to present a shifting image. The image that Antonia Fraser presents here is of a conscientious, modern-minded woman who does not want to be an object of mockery, who does not want to be an expensive bauble on, the court of the new king, and who is considerably more sympathetic and present in the narrative than that new king. Louis, I find it, I don't know, maybe you've had different impressions. If we had an in-person book club, this is the sort of thing that I would be asking you about over wine and calzones here. Maybe you didn't feel this way, but in these chapters, I lost whatever little sympathy I had for Louis to start with. He becomes corpulent, depressed, self-pitying, clueless, tone-deaf, all the things that a monarch who is sitting on a fire keg must not be. The image that we get a couple of times in these chapters of him making his way to his wife's chambers so that he can break down in tears and cry, woe is me, when she's the one dealing with constant childbirth and with children, including one of her sons, pitilessly dying of tuberculosis of the spine. It's an ordeal. And Fraser spares you none of it, but there's only one of the boy's two parents that is facing that ordeal with anything that even remotely looks like courage. That dichotomy is easy to see. I think that it holds true in a lot of biographies. It could have been less severe in a different biographer's hands. What I'm trying to say here is that these chapters, if it wasn't obvious beforehand in this book, it is obvious in these chapters that Antonia Fraser is fond of Marie Antoinette. You might even go so far as to say she is on Marie Antoinette's side. I hesitate to put it that way. Fond, yes, but I hesitate to say on her side because that implies that you might get untrustworthy narrative, and I don't think you do. But it sure is put to the test with the signature event of these chapters, which is the affair of the diamond necklace. I'm sure that some of you were familiar with that affair before you read this book. If you're reading this book for the first time, you might still have known that. An obscenely opulent necklace that involved Marie Antoinette and severely hurt her in the eyes of the people. Antonia Fraser exonerates her completely. And there's ample evidence. There's ample primary evidence that all of that was, that when you read that story and you think, oh, what a frippery-minded airhead, you are reading propaganda. You're reading canards that were forged by her enemies. There's ample documentation that is true, and that is the version that you get here of the affair of the necklace. All the other people involved might have been wrong, but not Marie Antoinette. I think that's fascinating. It will be up to you whether or not you find it convincing. I also find it convincing. I love the portrait that I'm getting here of this character and how it is so clear in these chapters what kind of a queen she wants to be. And it's very much like her mother and not like most queens of France. She doesn't want to be rapacious. She doesn't want to be severe. She doesn't want to be remote, and she doesn't want to be useless. And that becomes even more touching because these are the chapters when you see beyond a shadow of a doubt, especially at the end, towards the end of the chunk that we're reading today. Here you see that not all the best intentions in the world are going to help. The tide is changing. The time is changing. There's nothing that Marie can do about it. Not as conscientious as she ever wants to be. Nothing that she can do will change the fact that when she acceded to the throne, the popular operas of the day would mention her by name on stage, and the audience would erupt in applause and cheering and weeping. And by the end of the chapters that we're reading here, the mere mention of a cruel or an ignorant or a spiteful queen with no proper mention of Marie Antoinette herself, the mere mention of a bad queen in a Racine play causes the whole audience to cheer. Everyone in that audience was thinking of her. And you get the strong impression that an awareness of that had percolated through the hallways at Versailles. This Marie Antoinette Antonia Fraser's Marie Antoinette does not present us with the one comforting out that another Marie Antoinette at the hands of another biographer might have presented us. knowing what's coming. If we know what's coming and we can see that mood in all the levels of society in Paris curdling, the one out we could have that would be comforting is that the Marie Antoinette at the heart of the biography is such a clueless airhead that she doesn't see it coming. And Antonia Fraser does not give us that Marie Antoinette. This Marie Antoinette definitely knows that something serious is wrong. Her husband, I guess, to give him credit, knows too, and convokes an Estates General. We know as a reader what's coming. And we can, in hindsight, we can look back and say, well, that was a bad idea. Here are some things you could have done to forestall this. But it's not for certain that this fever could have broken in any way other than the way that it does. The way that it does is famous, and that is the way that this fever breaks, crests and breaks, is our next installment. That is the end of the story, is the next installment that we're doing. Heartbreaking, extremely more so than in any other Marie Antoinette biography, because Antonia Fraser has given us a Marie we care about. At least me. Is it true for you? I would imagine that if at this point you're not caring about Marie as a person, then you aren't going to care about her. So the next chapters that we're going to read to the end for the next batch of the Steve Tiberius Donoghue Book Club, I would imagine that if you don't care about Marie now, you're going to get your jollies in the next few chapters, because it's all misery from here on out. And the focus of the narrative magnifying glass, goes into fine-grained detail. The end of this story, Antonia Fraser is a popular biographer. That is not, in my mind, a pejorative. But if you're a popular biographer, you want to keep in mind what the audience is expecting. You can subvert some of it. Antonia Fraser is not giving us a Madame Deficit. She's not giving us an airhead here. The kind of figure that you might be expecting with a line like, let them eat cake. But she can't subvert your expectations completely. You know what's coming, and she knows as a biographer that you want a lot of attention paid to that. So that's what you will get. It would be the same thing if I keep bringing up Julius Caesar here, but the reason I bring him up is because he's another figure where you know the ending. You know how the story ends. And in that, if you wrote a 500-page biography of Julius Caesar and his assassination was one paragraph at the end of the last page of the book, well, you know that wouldn't please your readers. Readers of popular biography want that story. They're perfectly happy to learn a lot about a historical figure, as we are with this book, but they want a lot of attention paid to the one or two details that they know. I think that's why we have so much attention paid in the chapters that we're reading today to the affair of the diamond necklace, which was, I think, better known to an earlier generation than it is to this one. General historical knowledge for the last 50 years has been in severe decline. It's not taught in schools anymore, so I don't know that will have the resonance that it once did. I would like to know what resonance it had for you. It's a thrilling story. It's a thrilling story of the cardinal and his primary henchwoman, and the differences in their fates. And the court believes that he is innocent, that he is not the bad guy of the story, whereas she is brutally treated, just brutally treated, branded as a thief with a hot iron. It's supposed to be branded on her shoulders, but she's struggling so much when it happens that the brand slips and she is branded on her breast. I don't know that I believe that detail, but it's just too French to be real. But I'd love to know. More so with these chapters, the first two batches, you're firmly in Antonia Fraser's hands. No matter what you know about Marie Antoinette, you're not going to know about her childhood with Maria Theresa. But these chapters, you might know about them. And I want to know, you're more firmly out in your own territory here. I want to know, did you feel the narrative shaping hand of the biographer? And if so, did you object? Is this convincing? This is my second time reading this book, and I am more convinced than ever that this is an accurate portrait of Marie Antoinette, which is going to make the last chapters that we're reading utterly heartbreaking for me. Maybe that's not true for you. I want to hear all about it. We will wrap this book up next time. So I will end this installment, and I will see you then. Thank you, BookTube.